Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
So the leadership question there on the justice issue is very difficult. It forces you to what I would call a cultural societal analysis.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Mr. Robert Anderson, an organizational and leadership consultant. The topic of this week's Reflections is leadership and working for justice. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Bob, let's talk a little bit about leadership. Why don't you tell me how you got into all of that? How did you get your interest? And I've read some of your papers on leadership, and I know you give workshops on the topic and so on. And why don't you tell me how you got your interest in all of that?
Well, it's a long story. I don't want to make it a long story because
we only have 27 minutes on
this program. So, I can talk all 27 minutes.
I'm sure
and
you
answer
can.
That question.
Yes.
But it really started for me of working in organizations and finding that I cared more about the people than I realized, and wanting to find ways to really help them and help organizations be places where people could really flourish. And that got me into the field of organization development, which led me into the field of leadership, which is where I really began to care passionately about this field and the work, because I think, as we've talked, it cuts right to the heart of some very important spiritual questions. And so,
I think the question of leadership, really is crucial. It's the great interest in it these days, and you can use it as an entree into many questions. I know in looking at your own work that you use it almost to move you towards what I'd call a spirituality of work, that a lot of leadership questions arise around the work site and how people respond to the situation there and the opportunities, and that spirituality of work is going to call people forth to use their own talents and gifts to create a better situation, so that we're not just passive victims of a large bureaucracy. So I begin to see, a spirituality of work that connects in with the question of leadership. I think that there's other more direct ways in which the question is real these days. People who are in charge of something are trying to figure out how to do it better. So that people in parishes, for example, who have to run liturgy committees end up thinking, well, I better figure out how to do this. How do I run a meeting? How do I try to get people involved? How do we sell our ideas to the larger parish? So before long, they're looking for some workshop or something that can help them to be a more effective leader in all of that. So there is great interest, and you can see it in the corporate world. I believe a lot of that, I see self-interest in that. In other words, if I'm going to move up in the corporate ladder, I better figure out how to play this game and to work within this structure and in order to move ahead and be successful. So there's a lot of entrees into the question, but what is clear is it's very alive. And you can look at leadership in a lot of different ways. There's a dynamics about leadership. You can look at it in terms of what dynamics are at work in leaders. And what I see, one thing is that leaders have vision. The great leaders are able to articulate a dream of where they want us to go. And then people say, I buy into that. I'll do that. And the other thing I see leaders doing is empowering. They help other people to grow, and they're interested in them. Much as in your own story you were saying, part of it is because you saw that people were hurting in situations. You wanted them to flourish. I liked your word, flourish, help them to grow. So we're empowering and helping people to flourish. And I think that we're doing other things as well in all of this. We're trying to be good servant leaders so that other people can tell we're sort of wounded healers, that we know where they're at and how hard it is. And now I'd like to look at another aspect of this as well. Leadership is trying to establish justice in the world. Now that's a large, big picture here, but it ought to focus some of our attention, because leadership needs to have larger concerns, and justice is a great and beautiful and rich word, both in the biblical tradition and other religious traditions, and in the secular world as well. Justice becomes something that is worth working for. So, you want to start to comment at all after that very long introduction here of leadership and working for justice?
You're right. The word is rich and noble and in the corporate world, and even in Catholic corporate organizations, healthcare, etc., the word justice is not well received.
Mm-hmm. What is the problem with the word justice?
It confronts. Underneath it, I think, is it begins to really help us examine, or scares us that we would examine some of the basic things in the way we do work. There are many, many justice issues in corporations. And
well, we hear a lot of them. I mean, one of them is, are they going to hire women and pay them well? Are they going to deal with child care kind of questions that the society thrusts upon them? But those kind of questions, of course, are not just in the corporate world. They're for all institutions.
That's right.
So we can't just single them out. There's all kind of justice questions within the church as well that have to be attended to.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about leaders now and trying to make something worthwhile and have a larger cause, I think justice is a good catchword. In fact, we ought to force it upon leaders and all of us who have leadership questions. Let's take it to the family. I mean, I know families, abusive families, dysfunctional families. I know families where one child is just treated so nicely and another one, for one reason or another, is put down and given extra work to do and really made to feel terrible in so many ways. There's a justice question. You ought to have love in a family, that's true, but you ought to have a minimum of justice to start with, and very often we see that isn't there. What does it mean to have a patriarchal family where the husband treats the wife like a servant?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have justice there. We don't have love, but we don't even have some other minimal idea of equality and mutuality and fair play. So let's thrust the question of justice right into the mix on leadership. Let's force it.
The reason that I say it's a word that it sort of raises the hair on your back, because it confronts. I mean, for example, in my own business, I'm in consulting business, and consultants charge exorbitant rates. I mean, we charge really high. It's in some ways it's kind of ridiculous. I'm not worth what they pay for me, and yet you can get it. And one of the things I'm noticing is the consequences of my charging high rates are that only the few and the chosen attend my seminars, and that the masses, the people at the lower levels who are deeply disempowered and need to really be helped and confronted with some of this stuff, don't get it. And it's a financial, they can't afford it. Organizations legitimately cannot afford to do that. And so that's a justice issue, which for me at the moment is very confronting. And I'm beginning to say, well, I know it's the standard that I'm charging way less than the standard rate, and the consequences of the way that we...
That brings out the situation as a whole in our country, the haves and the have-nots, those that can benefit from education, from conferences like you give, institutes and so on, and people who have no access to that world.
Yeah.
And even worse, who have no interest in that. I mean, when you start looking at the justice question that way in terms of leadership, I mean, we're confronted with massive problems. Maybe that's one reason people don't want to think of leadership and justice, because the problems are just so immense. I was at a conference the other night. We were talking about poverty here in our own area, and there was a speaker there who was trying to describe for us what that means and how people are really entrapped in that poverty situation, have no alternatives, they can't figure out how to get out of there. And then you've got an educational system that doesn't serve them well, and you got a parental generation that maybe isn't pushing them to learn or isn't a role model for them and going on to higher education. Now you begin to see the injustice that exists right within our own society. We see how we, for example, have reaped the terrible fruits of the slavery system. I mean, there's a ripple effect. I mean, it's carried on. I mean, here we got a group of people systematically deprived of education and a family life, and then somehow, are asked back into the mainstream, or supposedly they're given that opportunity. As Jesse Jackson said, you got to be able to walk through that door when it's opened up in some ways. But we have to just take responsibility, it seems to me, for the sins of slavery. And I'm not talking, that's not the topic we're on, but it just strikes me as an example. Leadership has to be willing to confront that and be willing. I'm looking for political leaders who can talk like that and can bring out the fact that we have to be a caring community for those who are less fortunate.
I agree.
So the leadership question there on the justice issue is very difficult. It forces you to what I would call a cultural societal analysis wherever you are. And that's one of the things I get out of your writings on leadership is that great importance of being a leader in any situation where you find yourself. Don't just wait to be called upon to lead the world. Try to do it in your family and in your work site and in your parish and so on. That's where the action is. And I like that. And maybe what we should be doing is being attuned to the injustice where we are.
Yeah, I think that's the starting place. And my sense is that the larger injustices that we see around us, the massive injustices, are the aggregation of a lot of small decisions along the way that create the system that we're in. The injustice is the whole system and the outcome of this complex culture and system and it's a series of very small interrelationships of which our own behavior, our own life stance is a part.
That's a good notion you bring out there, and that is the interconnected character of all of life and the social systems in which we live. I think that's one of the premises of any analysis of the question of justice, is that we're not operating as isolated individuals. No system can be separated out from the other systems. It's all an interconnected network, and you have to begin to think in those kind of global terms. We have to think in global terms.
I heard a quote, and I don't remember exactly, but it was something like that we throw away enough aluminum every year to rebuild our air fleet. Now I can't remember if it was rebuild it once or rebuild it twice, but that's a massive thought. And I throw away, aluminum cans, and not very many actually, but in the aggregate, we're squandering that resource.
Yeah, we become part of the problem rather than part of the solution in that way.
Yeah.
Now, where are we going to look, Bob, to try to get some sense of this leadership and justice? We've had great figures in our own time, people who have done it in quiet kind of ways, have tried to create a more just society and a more peaceful world. We get some sense of it there. Maybe we get it from political leaders who are able to exercise courage. I think a lot of people these days look at Gorbachev and say, here's a guy who's trying to lead in terms of peace. Now, there's all kind of self-interest in that. We all know that. There's a nationalism and all kind of problems whether he can be successful or not. But I think he's captured something in the world of having the momentum for peace. Of being willing to say and taking some concrete actions like the withdrawal from Afghanistan and so on. So, odd examples that might be to look at Gorbachev. He gets press along that line. He makes an influence in Europe along that line. If you ask people today who's giving us the momentum for peace in the world, a lot of people would point to him.
Yeah.
He's captured some of the symbols and taken the high ground on many issues and so on.
Yeah, I agree, and at great risk.
Yeah.
The man politically is walking a tightrope in the Soviet Union, so it's.
But the reason for bringing him up is to start to see what would it be like to really be a leader for justice in our ordinary settings. And one of the things you're going to see is risk, and there's a certain courage involved in all of this.
There's no safe way to create anything great, to create justice and there's no safe path to it, and one of the things that I notice and been a recent awareness is that there are organizations some of whom are doing some really questionable things in terms of environment and in terms of moving certain facilities overseas and paying people really. And the working conditions are poor and stuff. If we don't allow that here, why can we go overseas and allow it? That's a good question. And to even talk about that question in organizations, it's like they're not. What I see is that organizations aren't even ready to have a quality dialogue about those kinds of issues, because we can't even talk straight with each other about whether the meeting is going effectively. I sit in the meeting. It's not going. It's loud. It's boring. It's flat. We're talking about all the wrong issues, and I don't say anything. I go to the bathroom. I say, "Jesus, can you understand this meeting? Here we go again. Same old stuff." I go back to the meeting and say, "It's a great meeting. Let's go forward." Mm-hmm. And if we can't have a certain integrity around simple things, how how can we even begin to grapple with the larger questions of, is this corporation that produces these chemicals, is this really the work we want to be in? Is this really right? And those are questions which shake the foundation of the organization. They're worthy questions. They need to be discussed, and yet
very often hard to do. So one of the points you're making is that there has to be a certain truthfulness at the basis of being a leader for justice. You've got to be willing to speak the truth in any sort of
even
setting.
The mundane, and that a starting place for justice is to begin to work, can we tell the truth about this meeting? Mm-hmm. And in some ways it's preparing the soil for whether or not those kinds of more controversial discussions can actually take place.
Yeah, unless you're able to speak about the other matters, you're not going to be able to take on the larger issues.
And so a justice issue is this issue of truth, I think, in organizations.
It certainly is connected in.
Yeah.
Well, let's play that out in where do we see that happening in the various settings? I mean, if I look at the church, is the church willing to honestly look where it's at in the questions of women's rights within the church, or the way that members of the gay community are treated? Do we have, are we able to talk openly about those kind of questions? Whatever side you come down on it, at least can we open up the dialogue?
Yeah.
That would be part of truthfulness. And they're clearly related to justice questions, like are people treated with dignity, people who are different within the church community itself? You could say universities could do the same sort of thing. What about hiring practices and so on, and promotions and tenure? And you can look at the corporate world and ask that question. Heard a speaker recently talking about economic matters and saying, well, where are the people who are the decision makers? Are they really making an effort to try to move minorities and move women up through the ranks and to give them more powerful positions and so on? Is that really happening or not? And if it isn't, shouldn't people who are formed by the gospel or have sort of Christian outlooks, that was the framework for this meeting, shouldn't they be the leaders in that and speaking out on those kind of questions? Mm-hmm. So you can see it in any of the settings we find ourselves. You have to be truth speakers, have to be willing to raise the hard questions. I flashing on something that people used to talk about, group speak. I think that very often when you're in a group, if there's a dominant line of thought, that it becomes very hard to deviate from that. If everybody in the group thinks we're doing terrifically and treating everyone fine, it's awfully hard to raise your hand and say, well, wait a second, are we really dealing well with this minority group in this setting or not? I mean, no one wants to hear it. You become very unpopular.
There's a consultant who has a concept called the Abilene paradox, where a whole family ends up on a bus going to Abilene to visit some relative, and nobody wants to go, but nobody said that they did. Nobody wanted to say they didn't want to go. And so
the
Abilene paradox. They're all on a bus to Abilene, and nobody wants to go.
Nobody knows why we're on this bus going there.
Nobody wanted to risk the disapproval that would come with, I don't want to go.
Yeah.
And so courage, Peter Block, as a consultant, a friend of mine, defines courage as the willingness to move forward in the face of disapproval. And that at the heart of being able to stand for justice is courage. It's the willingness to take those stands, to bring up those issues, and risk disapproval,
Do you think that's really possible in the corporate world or the world of government? I think of the whistleblowers, and I think we have legislation now to try to protect whistleblowers, the people who have looked at Pentagon spending, for example, or corruption in government and have been willing to speak out about it. Very often they get fired. There's a whole series of people who have been victims because they've been willing to say something was not right.
Yeah.
And you begin to wonder. So, I mean, I'm glad that they would be protected in some way legally if they're going to do that, because we have to try to encourage more people to be willing to challenge what's wrong within systems like that.
And there is courage. There's no, as I say, there's no safe path, and that's where the real courage is required. Now, one of the things about that is that there's three ways to engage this culture, this system, this justice issue. One is to sort of conform and say, okay, go along, I can't do anything about it. And that's sort of the dependent, nothing I can do about it stance. And that's dominant, I think.
The dominant.
The other extreme is the rebellion, is the anarchist. It's kind of like, I'm going to stick it to you.
Pull the whole system down.
And whistleblowing fits into that category. It's kind of going around the system. It's not working within it in a constructive dialogue that that is patient, that supports the basic mission and thrust of the organization, that wants to help push it to the next step in its evolution. That's a more mature and more of a leadership role. That I think there's a role for prophets in rebellions, but they don't last long in systems. They do get shot.
So you're seeing three approaches to working within systems to try to create greater justice.
Right.
I mean, one response is you sort of get paralyzed and say there's nothing I can do, and you just go along with it. The other is let's pull it all down, be totally rebellious, and so on.
Yeah.
And then you're suggesting a more constructive approach where you are within the system and try to use its own machinery and institutions, procedures in order to move it towards justice. I'm reminded of Reinhold Niebuhr, talked a lot about proximate justice. He thought we were in great danger of talking idealistically about reforming the whole world and creating a beloved community. That was Martin Luther King's notion for where he wanted to go, create the beloved community. Well, Niebuhr talked more about proximate justice, something that was attainable, something that you could move towards. And I'm thinking that one of the great roles of leaders in this justice question is not just to be courageous, which is absolutely important, I agree with you, and the whole thrust of our discussion, but also to be strategically wise.
Yeah.
That is, to be prudent, to have intelligence, to understand the dynamics of the system, to understand the circumstances, and to come up with precisely the right strategy that will move us forward towards what Niebuhr called proximate justice, that is, more equal situations. So let's talk about that strategy business. That's part of being a leader.
Yeah. The myth is that I can find a risk-free strategy, and that's where manipulation comes in. That I begin to try to manipulate the system. I try to influence you in careful, hidden ways. I subtly shade the truth to protect myself, and it works. It does work in terms of getting decisions made and building support for a certain direction. But it doesn't work in terms of creating just systems, because it's built on lack of truth. Which ultimately undermines the ability of the organization to deal with justice issues. And so one does need to be strategic and careful and think through and take responsible action, not go so far as to break it off. And there's no safe way to do that. And the wish for a safe path leads us to manipulation, leads us to trying to be clever, careful, strategic, to package it.
I see. So your major point there is that it is a real fallacy to think we can move it forward with painlessly.
Right. Or with no risk to ourselves.
With no risk, yeah. Which really it cannot be the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point and worth thinking about, because if one thinks that way, there will always be the risk. Therefore, one will get paralyzed again and end up really doing nothing, or being terribly bent out of shape if one's initial effort does cause some sort of friction within the organization.
See, and when the topic is leadership, leaders live on the frontier, and there's no safe way to live on the frontier.
No.
And so it's
always going to be risk.
There's a risk, there's a cut. It's part of the thrill of leadership, and it's part of. I mean, there is the reason I like this leadership topic is that it does call us to greatness. It calls us to a cause that's larger than ourselves. It calls us to questions of meaning. It calls us what's worth risking for. It calls. Which are all very spiritual questions.
Yeah, and very prudential judgments have to be made about that. I mean, it's a question of where do you make your stand very often.
Yeah.
And I think that is connected in with the future. In other words, it doesn't seem to me for a small item to make your stand if you're going to play your trump card that way, and then next week when there's a larger issue, you've lost all clout or leverage. There's where the prudence comes in again. I'm thinking of Maritain, Jacques Maritain, great Catholic philosopher of this century, coined that phrase used by others, that what we need was a tender heart and a tough mind. And the tender heart gives us a sense for the people who are suffering. A man came up to me the other day and said, I don't have any passion for justice, he said. interesting, and I tried to point out that maybe he does. In my conversation, I said, well, don't you care about the downtrodden? He said, oh, yeah, I care about the downtrodden, and so on. And I was suggesting there's your way to build your passion for justice. Start with what's real to you. And so we need the tender heart that's able to see those who are hurting and recognize the pain of those who are oppressed, to get a feeling for what it means to be on the margin, at least try to empathize with those people. The tender heart, care, compassion, but then the tough mind says, now what am I going to do about it? How do I think my way through this? What are the appropriate strategies for making progress? Yeah. And leadership, I think, it probably would be that which would demonstrate that. Good leaders would show that, come up with some good strategies, but also try to get you to come up with some good strategies that fit your very situation. Maybe I would preach to parents that way. Well, if you really are in a dysfunctional family, why don't you find a strategy that's going to help you? So maybe I have to tell the wife who's passive dependent, look, in little things you have to begin to assert yourself, so that your husband will take you seriously and begin to realize you have a unique personality and particular needs. Maybe that's her first step, just to articulate needs in a particular situation, trying to create greater justice in her own family.
Yeah.
So this is a complex question. I like the way you approach it, of saying the leadership does bring up really deep matters. It brings up questions of meaning. And I like the way you said it, too. It brings up, what are you willing to risk for?
Yeah. And that's ultimately comes, justice is a piece of that. And,
what are you willing to risk for? What do you treasure, and so on, and in the whole mix. And I suppose that we would have varying capacities in this strategic ability. If I say I'm the leader and it's a justice issue and I really don't have much sense of it, seems like what I got to do is maybe call upon experts, or call upon the sort of concrete street wisdom that I would find among the people that I'm trying to motivate here. Maybe some of them got good ideas about how you're going to create a more just society. Or
yeah, you're right. There's one of the things that's interesting. There's a justice movement. There's a group of people who
I can see a large idea coming. You have to compress it.
Oh, okay. The notion is that that's the service they provide. Is that they confront me, they help me, they put they're a thorn. They help me serve, help me question, help me reflect, help me. It's not always comfortable, and ultimately, I need that push in order to go into a larger system
and now that's the role of the prophet.
That's the role of the prophet.
Great prophets that we've seen in history and in our country and in the social movements, they call us to task, they raise our consciousness, and they suggest directions to go in. And that is very valuable. Now, they become leaders. And Bob, one of these things about leadership, we all do it our own way. Not everyone's a great leader. Not everyone's Martin Luther King. But all of us in our own little setting got an opportunity to try to create a little better situation, to empower others, and to create a little more justice in the little circle we call our own world.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Mr. Robert Anderson, an organizational and leadership consultant. The topic of this week's Reflections was leadership and working for justice. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.